When filming time lapses on the Canon C70, you are going to run into one major issue, a severe lack of motion blur. But I do have a partial solution. The motion blur that you capture in a time lapse is determined by two factors, your shutter speed and the actual speed of your subject. If you max out your shutter angle to 360 degrees, you're not gonna have very much motion blur, unless your subject is moving very, very quick, a lot speedier than my slider in these tests. It won't look any different than just recording a video clip and then speeding it up in post. But there's one thing that you can do to eke out a little bit more motion blur when shooting time lapses on the C70, and that's to change your entire shutter mode from shutter angle or shutter speed to slow. I happened upon this setting when creating my C70 user guide course, which I launched recently, where I cover everything from how to nail exposure to how to pick the right recording options for the right project, and more niche features like this. So far, some people seem to have really enjoyed it. It's linked in the description if you want to learn more. So when you change your shutter mode from speed or angle to slow, it locks in your shutter speed at 1/12 of a second, which is just barely better than the 1/24th of a second that you could get in shutter speed, which is the same as 360-degree shutter angle. So a very marginal improvement, but it could be the difference between capturing any motion blur or not. So this is what it looks like to record just a normal video clip with 1/48th of a second, proper shutter speed for video, and then just speeding it up in post. So now this is what it looks like if I decided, hey, I want a little bit more motion blur. Let's open up my shutter as much as it can go in the normal mode, 1/24th of a second. Not very different. And now this is what it looks like when you change your shutter mode to slow. And you can tell that there is a tiny hint of motion blur there, but it doesn't come close to the type of motion blur that you can capture with a real photo camera, like my EOS RP. I am not a photographer, I only work in video production, so this is the photo camera that I own just for personal use. And even though it's a fairly low-end mirrorless camera, it can still take far superior time lapses to my Canon C70. Now we'll do that same slider test with this camera, starting at 1/12, which was the same as the slow mode in the C70. And now if we open it up to 1/8, we get a little bit more. But when you get to these quotation marks, which indicate seconds, that's where I tend to want to live with most time lapses. At a half-second shutter, we have a decent amount of motion blur. I'd be probably satisfied with this in a lot of situations. But when we go to the full second, that is where I really start to get that look that I'm always going for with a time lapse. It gives you that wow factor that you just do not get with sped up footage. Of course, it's possible to overdo it. Here's what a 30-second shutter looks like on the EOS RP, and you can no longer even see the subject. But I'm pretty much universally always going for more motion blur, not less. But if you're shooting a much longer time lapse, something that might take hours or days, like a flower blooming or ice melting, motion blur probably will not be critical for that style of time lapse. So the C70 has less of a handicap in those situations. Okay, when it comes to actually shooting the time lapse, you're going to choose interval mode. Why they don't call it time lapse mode, that's beyond me, but that's what it's called. And the interval is how long the camera waits between taking still frames. It can go anywhere from a second to 10 minutes. And the selection above that, the frame rate, you should basically never touch. I cannot think of a single instance in which it would make sense to have more than one frame captured at a time, because really what you're doing there is just taking a small video clip and then jumping forward in time, and then taking another small video clip and then jumping forward in time. And it will actually look worse than if you just shot footage and then sped it up in post. So always leave that at 1. A few quick miscellaneous tips here. I would definitely turn autofocus off. You can see that I got burned by that in this test here when my subject melted, so the autofocus racked to the back. I would also recommend shooting in C-Log 2 for the most dynamic range. That's just kind of a generic best practice when shooting with the C70, but it's definitely also true with time lapses because these clips are video clips. You are not getting photos from the camera that you will then post-process into a time lapse. You get a time lapse that you can review right away in the media tab and then edit just like normal footage and color just like normal footage. But one of the big things that differentiates it from normal C-Log to C70 footage is that you can't shoot in RAW. You have to choose between MP4 or XFABC. So that's another reason, totally separate from the motion blur issue, that makes me recommend shooting time lapses on a photo camera, not the C70, because on real photo cameras, you can shoot actual RAW photos. Not only will the resolution likely be superior in those RAW photos compared to the C70's compressed video, you will also have the ability to process those photos in a software like LR Timelapse, which lets you set keyframes to adjust your exposure of the raw photos, deflicker the photos, which really gives a super nice polish to time lapses. You can make white balance adjustments over time, and you'll just have way more flexibility and probably end up with a way better result going through that professional workflow of taking photos that you turn into a time lapse versus baking it in camera, which is the only way that you can do it with the Canon C70. But maybe not all of us want to take all that time to edit those time lapses into masterpieces. We just want a quick thing for social media. And in that instance, it is far more convenient to record a time lapse in camera. You'll just not end up with as nice of a product. But if we're being real, the C70's C-Log2 image is fantastic. So personally, it's more about the motion blur issues and lack thereof that prevent me from shooting time lapses on the C70. I always gravitate towards my cheap mirrorless camera for time lapses because I'm able to get that shutter drag. If you are new to the Canon cinema ecosystem, or you feel like you just might not be making the most of your Canon C70, then I strongly recommend checking out my course below that has everything you probably ever wanted to know and more. It's about 4 hours long. All of the chapters are downloadable. I think it's pretty good. All right, see you next time.